we'd like to talk about FSMA and an overview of FSVP. What is it? What is the Foreign Supplier Verification Program? Very short background. Before FSMA, FDA's import program was primarily sort of a search and destroy, trying to find problems in the food industry, or the food products that are being imported. The increase of imported food throughout the years made it more and more difficult. FDA's exam rates were always going lower and lower and lower. They got to the place where the FDA simply was unable to even identify where they should be looking in order to find food safety problems on imported food. In that case, FSVP is probably the place that has some of the biggest impact on the food industry because so much food is imported. And what it did was it changed FDA's approach to imported food from looking for problems and hoping to find them as a needle in a haystack, and it shifted the requirements for food safety to the importer. Now, FDA, under its regulations, has the power to require importers to put together a food safety verification plan under the FSVP program. And that's the biggest change in FSMA with respect to food safety. So what's in a food safety verification plan? Essentially, the agency can now require importers to identify the kinds of risks and hazards that might be associated with the food coming from a specific facility and require them to create a plan that controls through risk-based preventive controls that food safety hazard will not appear in the food that's being imported. So these could be hazards related to microbiological contamination, chemical contamination, physical contamination, and also Fsma specifically calls out the requirement to declare properly allergens that might be in food. And then the food importer must develop their own internal plan for how they're going to assess risks associated with their imported food. So who is an importer? Who does this rule apply to? Under the statute and the regulations, the rule applies to the U.S. owner or the consignee of the food. The consignee is the person that receives the shipment. That would be the importer. That person would be required to ensure that the foreign supplier and its food that's being imported is safe and has been processed according to whatever applicable food safety regime applies to that particular food. If there is no U.S. importer or no consignee, then it could be that the foreign supplier who has a foreign agent in the United States, a U.S. agent in the United States, could in fact be considered the importer and would be required, that person would be required to have the FSVP in place. So under FSVP, food importers are now required to perform a hazard analysis. The hazard analysis is to identify known or reasonably foreseeable food safety risks. These are potential hazards. There's a number of categories of potential hazards. For instance, biological hazards. These may be parasites that could be in food or bacteria that could cause foodborne illness. Chemical hazards, pesticides that could produce safety risks, or food decomposition. Physical hazards such as glass or metal that might be found in product because of the processing equipment. But FDA's regulation also considers the source of these hazards. For instance, hazards could be naturally occurring. They could be unintentional. They could arise just by the processing and by the failing to handle the food a certain way in order to protect the food from food safety risks. But a brand new category FDA now has authority to regulate are intentional contaminations. Those kinds of contaminations that ordinarily occur because of fraud. This is a new authority given to FDA in large measure because of the melamine event, where melamine was found in so many different food items that were being imported into the United States. There are exemptions to the FSVP. These exemptions are slightly different than some of the other provisions under FSMA. They are, for instance, facilities and imported food that is subject to and in compliance with seafood and juice HACCP requirements. Raw materials to be used for seafood and juice facilities that are themselves subject to HACCP. That is, the raw material going into a facility that's subject to juice HACCP and seafood HACCP. Food that's intended for research and evaluation. Food intended for personal consumption, which is an interesting exemption. And then food that is considered to be compliant if it's subject to some other food safety regime and is found to comply with it. So this might be the risk-benefit preventive controls or the standards for produce safety. It may very well be that FSVP is already covered because the food's already covered under those programs. Under FSVP, each importer is also required to perform a risk evaluation. Now, a risk evaluation is different than a hazard analysis. A hazard analysis is looking at specific food safety risks associated with the food that's being imported. And that's where we talk about the different types of risks and then where they could come from, intentional versus unintentional. A risk evaluation, however, is an evaluation of the food processor and looking at their compliance history over time to determine whether or not there is a risk associated with the company that's actually, or the manufacturer that's actually preparing the food and shipping it to the United States. So in this case, the importer is required to identify each of the kinds of risks associated with each type of manufacturer, and then also look at FDA and internal data to determine whether or not that facility represents an unreasonable risk as a food supplier. Importers under FSVP must also then perform verification activities. Once they've thought about hazards, they've conducted a risk evaluation, they now must verify that the foreign supplier is in fact complying with the relevant food safety regulation. That could be HARP-C, which is the preventive controls, or it could be standards for produce safety, or any other regime that's appropriate. So how do the verifications occur? It depends upon the types of hazards. If the hazard that's associated with the food is the kind of hazard that could cause serious adverse health consequences or death, then the default rule is the importer is supposed to ensure that an audit is conducted of the foreign facility before food is purchased from that facility, and then certain frequencies of audits occurring to ensure continued compliance. However, the FDA also says in their regulation that if there are other means that could be used in order to verify compliance besides an audit, then the importer must document that those other means will be just as effective, and then they would be able to avoid doing as many audits or maybe any audits. For food hazards that are not quite as serious as those that could cause death or serious bodily injury, there are other audits or other reviews that are possible through verification. It could be reviewing records, it could be testing product, it could be evaluating third-party inspections by reputable third-party inspection bodies. There's a number of different ways that you would be able to verify that the foreign supplier is complying with the rule. The final step under FSVP are corrective actions. If there's any issue that arises, the importer is obligated to investigate it and perform corrective actions to try to prevent that from occurring in the future. And of course, under all systems with FDA, documentation is going to be key, ensuring you're explaining why you're doing what you're doing, how you're doing what you're doing, and why what you're doing works. That's the basic principle to ensure that imported food is in compliance with the law under the new program. Thank you for spending a few minutes with us here at FDAImports.com. We remain committed to helping the industry and our clients understand and comply with these regulations as they're implemented by the FDA.